The training facility on Arcturus Station stretched across 3 kilometers of reinforced steel and transparent aluminum. It floated in the cold darkness between stars, a monument to the Galactic Coalition's belief that all species could learn to fight together. Cadets from 40 different worlds walked its corridors, ate in its mess halls, and trained in its simulation chambers. They came speaking different languages and carrying different histories, but they all shared one thing. They all believed they were the future of galactic warfare. Believed this more than most. He was born on a water world where his people had evolved 4 arms to navigate the complex reef systems of their home. His scales shifted color with his mood, though he had learned to control this tell during his years at the academy. Right now they held a steady blue, the color of confidence and calm. He stood near the back of Armory Bay 7 with 3 other cadets, watching the new arrivals file in for equipment assessment. They had joined the Coalition 800 years ago. They had proven themselves in the Periphery Wars, in the Syndicate conflicts, in a dozen smaller engagements that most species had already forgotten. His family had produced soldiers for 6 generations. His mother had commanded a battle cruiser. His father had died holding a defensive line on a moon whose name had tattooed in the old script along his primary right arm. He knew what soldiers looked like. He knew how they moved, how they carried themselves, how they treated their weapons. The human woman who walked into the armory that morning looked like none of those things. She was older than most cadets, perhaps 40 standard cycles, though humans aged strangely and had never been good at guessing. Her hair was dark with streaks of, pulled back in a simple knot. Her uniform fit properly but without the crisp precision that marked career military. She moved with an easy efficiency that suggested physical competence, but nothing about her screamed warrior. What drew attention was the case she carried. It was long and rectangular, made of some kind of polymer that looked almost organic. Scratches and scuff marks covered its surface, evidence of hard use over many years. The woman set it on the equipment bench with a gentleness that seemed almost reverent, and found himself drifting closer. The other cadets noticed too. Myra, with feathered crests and eyes that could see into the infrared spectrum, tilted her head in the way her species did when curious. Bane, a massive whose stone-like skin made him nearly impervious to small arms fire, rumbled a low question to no one in particular. The woman either didn't notice their attention or didn't care. She keyed a code into the case's lock and lifted the lid. His first thought was that she had brought a prop from a historical drama. The weapon inside was made of wood and metal, actual wood dark and polished to a deep shine. The metal parts were blued steel, a finishing technique that only recognized from museum exhibits. A scope sat mounted on top, a cylinder of what appeared to be glass lenses in a metal housing. No holographic sight, no ranging computer, no atmospheric compensation system, no magnetic acceleration coils. It was a rifle, a chemical propellant rifle, the kind that fired metal projectiles using explosive powder, a technology most species had abandoned before they achieved faster-than-light travel. Laughed before he could stop himself. The sound carried in the armory's excellent acoustics. Several other cadets turned to look. The human woman continued her work as if she hadn't heard, lifting the rifle from its case and beginning what appeared to be an inspection ritual. "Is this a joke?" asked. He kept his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, partly because he genuinely wanted to know and partly because the absurdity of the situation demanded comment. "Did they excavate this from one of your museums?" The woman still didn't look up. Her hands moved over the weapon with practiced ease, checking parts and mechanisms that couldn't identify. The rifle had a bolt action, he noticed. A manual bolt action. The user would have to cycle it by hand between each shot. "Perhaps it's a family heirloom," Myra offered. Her translator gave her words a musical quality that softened what might have been sarcasm. "Humans are known for their sentiment toward old things." "Sentiment is fine in a display case," said, "but this is a combat training facility. We're preparing for actual warfare against actual enemies. What is that antique supposed to do against modern armor, against shielding, against targets that can actually shoot back? The human woman set the rifle down on the bench. She had finished her inspection and seemed satisfied with what she'd found. Only then did she look at, and her eyes held an expression he couldn't quite read. Not anger, not embarrassment, something closer to patience, perhaps, or a kind of tired amusement. She didn't say anything. She simply turned back to her weapon and began the process of mounting the scope. Scales flickered toward orange, a flash of irritation that he quickly suppressed. He was about to speak again when a heavy hand landed on his upper shoulder. Instructor had approached without noticing, which was impressive given that the old stood nearly 3 meters tall and weighed at least 3 times what did. His species were descended from pack hunters, and they had kept the predator's ability to move silently when they chose. His face was a mass of scar tissue on the left side, a souvenir from a plasma burst that should have killed him. The eye on that side was a replacement, a mechanical orb that glowed faintly red in dim light. Had fought in the periphery wars. He had commanded infantry units in a dozen major engagements. He had watched more soldiers die than most species could count. And right now, he was watching the human woman with an expression that had never seen on his face before. It looked almost like respect. "That rifle," said quietly, speaking so that only could hear, "is a M200 intervention, .408 caliber. Her grandmother carried it in something the humans called the Resource Wars, and her grandmother's grandmother carried it before that." "An heirloom," repeated. "Charming, truly. But we're supposed to be training with actual weapons. Standard coalition plasma carbines, targeting systems, modern equipment." His mechanical eye clicked as it focused on his face. "Do you know why the coalition requires all cadets to qualify with their species' traditional weapons before they can graduate?" Did know. The regulation was old, dating back to the coalition's founding, when the various member species had insisted on preserving their martial heritage. Ceremonial purposes, cultural preservation, a nod to history before we move on to the future. That's what most people think. Turned back to watch the human woman. She had finished mounting the scope and was now loading rounds into the rifle's magazine. The rounds themselves were brass, dull gold in the armory's light, each one about the size of smallest finger. "I thought that too, until I served alongside humans in the syndicate conflicts." "And what changed your mind?" Was silent for a long moment. The human woman finished loading her rifle and began to disassemble it again, her movements smooth and automatic. She wasn't looking at her hands. She wasn't looking at anything. Her eyes had gone distant, unfocused, as if the rifle existed in her awareness without needing her direct attention. "That weapon," said, "kills across continents." Waited for more, but the instructor fell silent. After a moment, couldn't resist the urge to fill the void. "Our plasma carbines have an effective range of 800 meters," he said. "Under optimal conditions with atmospheric compensation, a skilled shooter can push that to 1,000. That rifle, whatever it is, fires a metal slug using chemical propellant. The physics alone limit it to, what, a few hundred meters at most." Made a sound that might have been a laugh, though with his species it was hard to tell. "A few hundred meters. Yes." He turned to face directly. "The humans developed that rifle when they were still bound to a single world, still fighting each other over resources and territory and ideas. They needed to end lives from distances their targets couldn't comprehend. So they built weapons that could kill from kilometers away, and then they spent generations teaching their children to use them." Kilometers. Scales flickered despite his best efforts. "That's impossible. The ballistic calculations alone, the windage, the gravity compensation, the effect. The targeting computer between her ears has been refined over 4 generations of her bloodline." Nodded toward the human woman. "The rifle has no smart link because she doesn't need one." Across the armory, the woman finished her disassembly and began putting the rifle back together. Her hands never hesitated. Her eyes stayed distant. The whole process took less than 30 seconds. Watched her, and for the first time he felt something other than amusement. The way she handled the weapon wasn't ceremonial. It wasn't performative. It was intimate in a way he recognized but couldn't quite name. He handled his plasma carbine with respect, because it was an expensive piece of equipment that could malfunction if mistreated. He cleaned it regularly, maintained it properly, stored it correctly. But he had never looked at it the way this woman looked at her antique rifle. Like it was part of her. "Tomorrow is live fire assessment," said. He turned to walk away, then paused. "I suggest you watch her shoot before you form any more opinions." Watched the instructor leave. Then he looked back at the human woman. She had finished reassembling her rifle and was now simply sitting with it across her lap, her hands resting lightly on the wood and steel. Her eyes were closed. She was breathing in a rhythm. Noticed. In for 4 seconds, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4, over and over. Her whole body was still, almost unnaturally so. No fidgeting, no shifting, just perfect, patient stillness. Scales settled back to blue. He told himself it didn't mean anything. She was just a human with an old weapon and some family tradition. Tomorrow's assessment would prove what everyone already knew. Modern equipment outperformed antiques. Always had, always would. He told himself that and almost believed it. But he couldn't quite shake the memory of his voice saying those words. That weapon kills across continents. The instructor had fought in wars that spanned star systems. He had seen weapons that could crack moons and burn atmospheres. And somehow, looking at that old rifle in the human woman's hands, he had sounded almost afraid. Went back to his equipment check and tried not to think about it. He was not very successful. The morning of the live fire assessment arrived cold and like most mornings on Arcturus Station. The facility maintained a standard day-night cycle keyed to Coalition Standard Time, but it never felt quite natural. The artificial sun that lit the corridors was too steady, too perfect. Real suns moved. Real light changed. Here, everything stayed the same. The cadets assembled at 600 in the preparation chamber, adjacent to the primary firing range. The range itself occupied a hollowed-out section of the asteroid that the station was built around, a kilometer of broken terrain under a contained artificial atmosphere. They had filled it with rocks and ridges and bunkers, creating a landscape that could simulate dozens of different combat environments. Arrived early, as he always did. His 4 arms made equipment checks faster than most species could manage, leaving him time to observe his competition. He counted 47 cadets scheduled for assessment today, representing 18 different species. Most carried standard Coalition plasma carbines, the same weapon he had trained with for the past 2 years. A few carried specialty weapons suited to their particular physiologies. The had a heavy plasma cannon that would have required tripod mounting for anyone without his species' immense strength. The human woman, according to her name patch, arrived exactly on time. She carried her antique rifle in a soft case slung across her back. Her expression was calm, almost blank. She nodded to the other cadets as she passed but didn't speak. Instructor briefed them on the assessment parameters. Standard engagement protocol. Targets would appear at ranges from 50 meters to the maximum effective distance of their issued weapon. Points awarded for accuracy, speed, and efficiency. Penalties for missed shots, wasted ammunition, and target failures. Top 30% would advance to the tactical simulation round next week. Bottom 10% would be required to repeat the basic marksmanship course. "Any questions?" asked. Nobody had questions. This was the 5th assessment of their training cycle. Everyone knew the drill. They drew lots for firing order, pulled number 19, pulled number 46 second to last. The first cadet stepped into the range, and the assessment began. Watched attentively, tracking the performance of his competitors. The targets were holographic projections over physical frames, capable of simulating movement and cover. They appeared in sequences of 5, each sequence at increasing range. A cadet had 10 seconds per target, then the next sequence began whether they were ready or not. Most cadets performed competently. The plasma carbines were reliable weapons with sophisticated targeting systems. A shooter didn't need much skill to hit targets at ranges under 500 meters. The computer did most of the work. Just point in the general direction, let the system acquire, squeeze the trigger. The magnetic acceleration did the rest. The real challenge started past 600 meters. At that range, atmospheric interference began to affect plasma cohesion. The targeting computer had to compensate for air density, wind, humidity, temperature. Even small errors in calculation could push a shot wide. The best shooters learned to anticipate these factors, to feel when the computer was about to make a mistake and adjust accordingly. His turn came. He stepped into the range, settled his primary hands around the carbine's grip, and let his secondary hands manage stabilization. The first sequence was easy, 50 meters, 5 targets, 5 hits. The second sequence pushed to 100 meters, still easy, 5 more hits. His scales glowed a satisfied blue as he moved through the middle distances, racking up points with mechanical precision. The trouble started at 700 meters. His targeting computer flagged uncertainty on the third target. The wind had shifted, pushing a microfront of cold air across the firing lane. The computer recalculated, adjusted, recalculated again. Could feel it hesitating. He overrode the system, trusted his instincts, squeezed the trigger. Missed the plasma bolt, dissipated 3 meters short of the target frame. He adjusted, fired again, hit, barely. The bolt caught the edge of the target, scoring partial points. He finished the sequence with his confidence shaken and his score dropping. 800 meters was worse. The computer couldn't keep up with the environmental variables. Switched to manual targeting, using his own senses to gauge the wind and compensate for the plasma drift. He managed 3 hits out of 5 targets. Respectable, not great. He walked out of the range to polite applause from the other cadets. His final score placed him in the top 20%, good enough to advance, good enough to maintain his ranking, but not as good as he'd hoped, and he knew it. The assessments continued through the morning. Some cadets did better than, some did worse. The Myra used her infrared vision to track heat patterns in the air and anticipate how they would affect her shots. She scored in the top 10%. They struggled with the longer ranges. His heavy plasma cannon sacrificed precision for power, and precision was what the assessment demanded. By the time stepped up to the range, it was well past noon. The artificial sun had shifted to afternoon angles, casting long shadows across the broken terrain. Most of the cadets had finished their assessments and drifted away to meals or rest. Only a handful remained to watch. Was one of them. Moved to the firing line without ceremony. She knelt, unzipped her soft case, and began assembling her rifle. The movements were exactly as they had been in the armory, smooth, automatic, almost meditative. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Each piece fit into place with the quiet precision of long practice. The rifle came together in her hands, wood and steel and glass. No computer. No targeting system, no magnetic acceleration, just a tube of metal, a mechanism to contain explosions, and a woman who had learned to make them both into a weapon. She loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, brass and copper and lead, watched her press each one into place with her thumb, a gesture so old that his species had never performed it. Then she did something unexpected. She ignored the first sequence of targets. They appeared at 50 meters, waited their allotted 10 seconds, and vanished without a shot fired. The second sequence at 100 meters received the same treatment, and the third, and the fourth. The observing cadets began to murmur, stood silently at the edge of the range, his expression unreadable. Was walking. She had slung the rifle across her back and was picking her way through the broken terrain, climbing toward a rocky outcropping near the middle of the range. Her movements were careful but not slow. She seemed to know exactly where she wanted to go. She reached the outcropping and lay down in a prone position. From where stood, she looked tiny against the stone, just a human-shaped speck with a rifle longer than her arm. She settled into place, adjusting her body in small increments until she was perfectly still. Then she raised the scope to her eye and began to wait. Borrowed magnification from a nearby observation drone. Through its cameras, he could see clearly now. Her eye was pressed to the scope. Her hands rested lightly on the rifle, one on the grip, one under the stock. Her entire body had gone rigid with a kind of controlled tension that had never seen before. She wasn't breathing. No, that wasn't quite right. She was breathing, but so slowly and so shallowly that it was nearly invisible. Her chest rose and fell maybe twice per minute. Her heartbeat, if could have heard it, would have dropped to a crawl. Every system in her body had slowed to conserve energy and eliminate movement. She was becoming a statue, a machine, a delivery system for a single piece of copper-jacketed lead. "What is she aiming at?" someone asked. Pointed toward the far end of the range. There, barely visible against the rock of the asteroid, a small structure perched on a ridge. Observation Post 7, a monitoring station used to track cadet performance from the far end of the range. 3.2 kilometers, said. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. Beyond the maximum range of any standard assessment target, but there's a drone stationed there for equipment calibration. She asked permission to use it this morning. 3.2 kilometers. Felt his scales shift toward pale, the color of shock. His plasma carbine couldn't hit a target at 1 kilometer under perfect conditions. 3.2 was beyond impossible. It was beyond absurd. The physics didn't work. The calculations were too complex. The variables were too many. Continued to wait. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 5. The cadets grew restless. Some of them started to drift away, convinced this was some kind of elaborate performance art rather than actual shooting. Even began to doubt what he was seeing. Maybe she was making a point about patience. Maybe she was demonstrating some kind of human meditative practice. Maybe she had no intention of firing at all. Then the rifle spoke. The sound was unlike anything had heard in a training facility. Plasma weapons hissed, energy weapons hummed, but this rifle cracked, a sharp explosive report that echoed off the rocks and rolled across the range like thunder. It was violent, primal, real in a way that modern weapons never quite managed. Worked the bolt. The spent brass casing ejected and tumbled away, glinting gold in the artificial light. She chambered another round without lifting her eye from the scope. 5 seconds passed. The observation post sensor array pinged. Direct hit on the calibration drone. The remaining cadets went silent. Fired again. The same crack, the same thunder, the same patient work of the bolt. 5 more seconds. Another ping from the distant post. Another hit. She fired 3 more times. 3 more hits. 5 rounds, 5 kills at a distance that should have been impossible. Then she rose, collected her brass casings, and began walking back toward the firing line. She passed within a few meters of. Her expression hadn't changed. She didn't look triumphant or proud. She looked exactly as she had looked in the armory, calm, patient, utterly certain of herself and her weapon. She paused beside him, wasn't sure why. Maybe she had noticed him watching. Maybe she remembered his laughter from the day before. "The Coalition built you weapons that think for you," she said. Her voice was quiet, meant only for him. "My people built weapons that taught us to think like hunters, like patience incarnate." She glanced at the plasma carbine still hanging from his shoulder. "Your rifle will fail when its computer does. Mine fails when I do." She walked on, watched her go. Behind him, he could hear the other cadets talking in hushed voices. He could hear dismissing them for the day, his tone carefully neutral. He could hear his own heartbeat, faster than it should have been. 3.2 kilometers, 5 shots, 5 hits. His plasma carbine suddenly felt very light in his hands, very fragile, very temporary. He stood there for a long time, thinking about patience, thinking about what it meant to become a weapon, thinking about the distance between heartbeats. He didn't laugh at the human woman's rifle again. The debriefing chamber was quiet when the cadets assembled the next morning. 47 of them sat in curved rows of seats, facing a raised platform where instructor stood beside a holographic display. The display showed a rotating image of his rifle, every component labeled and annotated in clinical detail. Had arrived early again. He had barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that crack of thunder rolling across the firing range. He saw the brass casing tumbling through the air. He felt the weight of his own weapon, suddenly inadequate in a way he had never considered before. He had spent the night hours researching. The station's archives contained extensive files on human weapons development, a history of violence stretching back thousands of years. He had read about black powder and rifled barrels and the evolution of the metallic cartridge. He had learned about muzzle velocity and ballistic coefficients and the terminal effects of various projectile designs. He had learned that humans had been killing each other at extreme distances for centuries before they ever left their planet. Waited until the last cadet was seated before he began. "Yesterday," he said, "you witnessed something that most coalition soldiers never see. A human markswoman demonstrating a skill that her species has cultivated for over 500 years. He gestured at the holographic rifle. This weapon is a M200 intervention chambered in .408 caliber. The design is approximately 400 standard years old. The specific rifle you saw yesterday is somewhat younger, only 120 years, but it has been in continuous service with a single human family for that entire span." He let that sink in. 120 years, longer than many of the species in the room had been part of the coalition, longer than some of them had known space flight. "The humans arrived late to our stars," continued. "They achieved faster-than-light travel only 3 centuries ago, while most of you come from species that have been spacing for. We expected them to adopt our technologies wholesale, as all younger species do." He paused. "And they have mostly. Their ships use our drives. Their soldiers carry our weapons. Their doctors use our medical technology. They are practical people. They recognize superior tools when they see them." He turned to face the cadets directly. "But they kept these." The holographic display shifted, showing image after image of human soldiers carrying antique weapons alongside their modern equipment. Saw rifles of various designs, bolt actions like semi-automatic variants, massive sniper systems that required 2 people to operate. He saw knives and swords and edged weapons of every description. He saw hand-to-hand combat techniques that looked more like dance than warfare. "In every human family with a martial tradition," said, "there is a weapon like this, passed down from parent to child, maintained, mastered. The coalition requires all cadets to qualify with their species' traditional weapons before graduation. For most of you, this is a formality, a ceremony, a nod to history before you move on to real combat with real equipment." His mechanical eye scanned the room, fixing briefly on each face. "For humans, it is something else entirely." He gestured again, and the display changed to show targeting data from the previous day's assessment. Shots appeared as glowing points on a 3-dimensional model of the firing range, each one connected to its target by a thin line of light. "Cadet fired 5 rounds at a range of 3.2 kilometers, said. 5 hits, 0 misses. Her rifle has no targeting computer, no environmental compensation, no magnetic acceleration, no SmartLink integration. It fires a metal projectile using chemical propellant. By the standards of modern warfare, it should not be able to hit anything beyond a few hundred meters. He zoomed the display in on the first shot. The targeting data broke down into components: wind speed, air density, temperature gradient, gravitational variation, rotation of the station's asteroid body. "These are the variables that affected her first shot," said. "Any one of them miscalculated would have pushed the round wide. There are 14 significant factors. She had to account for all of them simultaneously in her head without technological assistance." He let the numbers hang in the air. "Now I want you to understand something." His voice dropped lower, taking on an intensity that had rarely heard from him. "That shot was not exceptional by human standards. The current record for a confirmed kill with that weapon system is held by a human named Sarah at 4.1 kilometers, was grandmother." The chamber went very still. "The humans have been training these skills for 5 centuries, continued. "Longer, if you count the earlier weapons that led to this one. They developed them when they were still bound to a single world, still fighting each other over resources and territory and ideas. They needed to end lives from distances their targets couldn't comprehend. So they built weapons that could kill from kilometers away, and then they spent generations teaching their children to use them." He shut off the holographic display. "The maximum effective range of the .408 is listed in human technical manuals as 2.3 kilometers, he said. "That number represents what the weapon can reliably achieve with an average skilled operator. But humans don't train average skilled operators. They train specialists. They train families. They pass down not just the weapons, but the knowledge, the instincts, the trained responses that turn a 2.3-kilometer rifle into a 3.2-kilometer rifle." He paused. "The rifle hasn't changed in 400 years. The human has." Thought about what he had seen on the firing range. His impossible stillness, her slowed breathing, her patience measured in minutes rather than seconds. She had become something more than human in those moments, something tuned and refined by generations of practice. "Your plasma carbines are excellent weapons," said. "The Coalition spent decades developing them. They incorporate the best targeting technology from 100 worlds. They compensate for environmental factors automatically. They require minimal training to use effectively." He met eyes directly. "And when their computers fail, you will be holding expensive tubes." He walked to the edge of the platform. "I have served alongside humans in 3 wars," he said. "I have seen their ships destroyed, their equipment broken, their technology failing in the chaos of combat. And I have seen them fall back on skills that their ancestors learned in mud and snow and desert sand, skills written into their muscles and bones by centuries of practice. I have seen a human make kills with that rifle when every targeting system in our unit was down, when we were fighting blind, when modern warfare had failed us completely." He looked out at the cadets. "That is why the Coalition preserves traditional weapons training. Not for ceremony, not for culture. Because when everything else fails, and in war everything eventually fails, you need something that cannot be jammed, cannot be hacked, cannot be disabled by an electromagnetic pulse or a computer virus or a simple malfunction." He turned to go, then stopped. "Cadet will be holding a supplementary training session this afternoon for anyone interested in learning the principles of long-range marksmanship without technological assistance. I suggest you attend, not because you will ever match her skill, that takes generations to develop, but because understanding how humans think about warfare will make you better soldiers." He walked out of the chamber without another word. The cadets sat in silence for a long moment. Then slowly they began to file out. Saw several of them cluster together, talking in low voices. He saw others pull out their personal devices, presumably researching human marksmanship as he had done the night before. He found in the corridor outside. She was leaning against the wall, her rifle case at her feet. She looked tired, though not in a physical way, more like someone who had been explaining something obvious for a very long time. "I apologize," said. He stopped a respectful distance away, keeping his scales carefully neutral. "When you arrived, I laughed at your weapon. I didn't understand what I was seeing." Looked at him. Her expression was hard to read, not hostile, not friendly, just evaluating. After a moment, she seemed to reach some internal decision. "Your people have been in space for 800 years," she said. "Mine have been here for 3 centuries. Everything you know about war, we learned from you." She picked up her rifle case and slung it across her back. "But we didn't forget what we knew before." Said, "The training takes generations." "It does," started walking and fell into step beside her. "My great-grandmother learned to shoot from her mother, who learned from her father, who learned from his grandmother. The weapon goes back further than that. We just don't have records of everyone who carried it." She touched the case briefly, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. "Every one of them added something, found a better way to breathe or grip or aim, made some tiny improvement that got passed down with everything else." They reached an intersection of corridors, turned left toward the training facilities, followed. "Your people see weapons as tools," she said. "Instruments for accomplishing tasks. You replace them when better options become available." She glanced at him. "Mine see them as teachers. That rifle taught my great-grandmother that a single well-placed shot is worth more than 1,000 careless ones. It taught my grandmother that patience is a predator's greatest advantage. It taught my mother that the space between heartbeats is where wars are won." She stopped walking. "And it's still teaching me." Thought about his own weapon, his plasma carbine, issued from Coalition stores, identical to thousands of others across the fleet. He had never thought of it as a teacher. He had thought of it as equipment, as a tool for accomplishing objectives, as something that would eventually be replaced by better technology. "What does it teach you?" he asked. Was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed, becoming softer, more reflective. "That I'm not separate from my weapon," she said. "That I'm a component of it, the most important component, the one that can't be manufactured or programmed or replaced. The rifle gives me range and power. I give it judgment and precision and the will to fire." She met his eyes. "When I'm shooting well, I don't feel like a person using a tool. I feel like a single system with 2 parts, both of them essential." She started walking again. "Your plasma carbine can hit anything within its range," she said. "The computer does the math. The magnetics do the work. You're a trigger mechanism with opinions." She didn't say it cruelly. It was simply an observation. "My rifle can hit anything I understand well enough to calculate. My limits are its limits. When I get better, it gets better. When I fail, it fails." They reached the training facility. A small group of cadets had already gathered outside, waiting for the supplementary session. Recognized Myra among them, and several others from the assessment. Paused at the door. "You asked what my rifle teaches me," she said. "The most important lesson is this. Technology gives you capabilities. Skills give you options. When your capabilities fail, your options are all you have left." She looked at the waiting cadets, then back at. "I hope your carbine never breaks. I hope your targeting computer never fails, but if they do, I hope you have something left to fall back on." She pushed through the door and walked inside. Stood in the corridor for a long moment, feeling the weight of his weapon against his shoulder. Then he followed her in. The training session lasted 4 hours. Didn't try to teach them to shoot like she did. That would take years, if it was possible at all. Instead, she taught them to think like she did, to break down the variables, to understand wind and gravity and distance as problems to be solved rather than obstacles to be compensated for by technology. She taught them breathing techniques that slowed their heart rates and steadied their hands. She taught them observation methods that let them read environmental conditions from subtle cues. She taught them patience, true patience, the kind measured in minutes and hours rather than seconds. By the end of the session, scales had shifted to a color he had never seen them display before. Something between blue and green, between confidence and growth. He still didn't understand everything about humans and their ancient weapons. Maybe he never would, but he understood something he hadn't understood before. The rifle was old. The knowledge was older, but the skill, the real skill, the thing that made the impossible shots possible, was alive. It lived in hands and eyes and lungs. It had lived in her mother and her grandmother and all the generations stretching back before and computers and plasma weapons. And it would live in whoever chose to teach next. That realized was what made humans dangerous. Not their weapons, not their ships, not their technology or their numbers or their ambition. Their memory. They remembered what it was to fight without computers. They remembered what it was to kill without assistance. They remembered that in the end, when everything else failed, the only weapon that truly mattered was the one between their ears. And they made sure they never forgot.